Hello guys, Dr. Spooks here. If you enjoy my videos, please click the like button. It's the only way YouTube's algorithm really notices me. I would be very grateful to you. The wind howled like a living beast, its icy breath tearing through the dense forest. Snow fell in a relentless torrent, blanketing the world in white and obscuring every trail. William's legs burned with every step as he trudged through knee-deep drifts, his rifle slung over one shoulder and his pack weighing heavy on his back. He cursed the storm under his breath. This wasn't the wilderness he was used to. This was chaos, nature's fury unleashed. He almost didn't see the cabin. It loomed out of the blizzard like a mirage, its dark angular frame a sharp contrast against the blinding snow. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a promise of warmth and shelter. Relief flooded William's chest as he stumbled toward the door, boots crunching over the icy ground. He didn't bother knocking. This was survival, not politeness. Inside, the warmth hit him like a physical force. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the log walls. The cabin smelled of damp wood and unwashed clothes, and the air was heavy with tension. 4 pairs of eyes turned toward him as he entered, their owners frozen mid-conversation. Strangers. "Who the hell are you?" a burly man in a flannel jacket demanded. His voice was gruff, his expression guarded. "Just a hunter," William replied, shaking snow from his coat. "Blizzard caught me out there. Needed somewhere to ride it out." The man didn't lower his guard, but a woman sitting near the fire spoke up. "Let him stay, Gus. The storm's bad enough without tossing someone back into it." Gus grunted but didn't argue. The others introduced themselves. There was Rachel, the reserved hiker who had insisted he stay. Gus, the chatty truck driver. Sam, a grizzled old hermit who spoke in cryptic riddles. And Kyle, a young camper who looked like he didn't belong so far from civilization. The introductions were brief and awkward. Nobody seemed thrilled about the growing crowd, but the blizzard offered no alternative. William found a spot near the fire, his rifle resting within arm's reach. He had learned long ago never to let his guard down in unfamiliar places, especially with unfamiliar people. As the night wore on, the storm outside only grew fiercer. The windows rattled in their frames, and the wind's mournful wails seeped through the cracks in the walls. The group tried to make small talk, but the unease in the room was palpable. William watched the others closely, his instincts sharp. Something about the situation didn't sit right with him, though he couldn't put his finger on it. Finally, Rachel broke the silence. "This storm's not natural," she muttered, staring into the fire. "It feels wrong." Nobody responded, but William noticed the others shift uncomfortably. He gripped his rifle a little tighter. As the firelight flickered and the shadows danced, the storm raged on, and outside, somewhere in the swirling snow, unseen eyes watched the cabin. The hours dragged on, the storm showing no signs of letting up. The fire crackled and popped, its warmth doing little to thaw the chill that had settled in the room. William kept his hands close to the flames, watching the others through hooded eyes. They were an odd group, strangers thrust together by nature's fury, each keeping their own secrets. Gus broke the silence first, pulling a flask from his coat and taking a long swig. "Hell of a night to be stuck in the middle of nowhere," he muttered, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "You all just happened to be wandering around out here too, huh?" "I was hiking the back trails," Rachel said, her voice even. "Didn't expect the weather to turn so quickly." Kyle shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I was camping a few miles from here. The snow came out of nowhere. I barely made it this far." Sam, the hermit, chuckled softly. "Storms like this don't come out of nowhere," he said, his voice gravelly and low. "They come when the moon calls them." The group fell silent. Gus snorted. "The hell are you talking about, old man?" Sam leaned forward, his weathered face illuminated by the firelight. "Full moon tonight," he said, his tone almost conspiratorial. "And these woods, they've seen things that don't care much for people." William felt a flicker of irritation at the hermit's theatrics. He wasn't one for ghost stories, especially not now. "You think something out there's causing this?" he he asked, his voice calm but laced with skepticism. Sam shrugged. Not think, no. The others exchanged uneasy glances. Kyle looked like he wanted to ask more but thought better of it. Rachel stared into the fire, her face unreadable. Gus just shook his head and took another drink. William stood and moved to the window, peering out into the storm. The snow was so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet. Still, he felt the weight of the storm pressing down on the cabin, as though it wasn't just nature at work, but something more. His breath fogged the glass as he muttered to himself, "Stories don't kill people, wolves do." "You hunt often?" Rachel asked, breaking into his thoughts. "Enough," William replied, turning back to the room. "You get used to tracking things, staying sharp. Out here, it's the only way to stay alive." "You think something's tracking us?" Kyle's voice wavered, his nervousness almost palpable. William hesitated, then shook his head. "Not yet, but you don't want to be caught unprepared if it is." The room grew quiet again, the weight of his words settling over the group. Gus finally set his flask down, muttering about keeping watch. The others murmured their agreement, though no one seemed eager to volunteer. William settled back into his chair, his rifle resting across his lap. Outside, the wind screamed and the storm clawed at the walls. Whatever was out there, storm or beast, he knew they weren't safe. Not yet. The cabin settled into uneasy silence as the storm raged outside, its howls an ever-present reminder of their isolation. The group had divided the night into watches, though nobody seemed eager to take the first shift. Kyle volunteered, his nerves evident as he pulled on his coat and muttered something about getting more firewood. "I won't go far," he said, opening the door just wide enough to slip outside. A gust of icy wind swept in, chilling the cabin instantly. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving the rest of them alone in the flickering firelight. William watched the door for a long moment, his rifle resting across his lap. Something about the boy's jittery demeanor gnawed at him, though he couldn't say why. He leaned back in his chair, forcing himself to relax, but his instincts wouldn't let him rest. He'd spent years honing his sense for danger, and now every nerve in his body was telling him to stay alert. Minutes ticked by. The fire popped and the wind howled. Kyle didn't return. "How long's he been out there?" Rachel asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but her eyes betrayed her unease. "Too long," William said, standing. He moved to the door, grabbing his coat on the way. "I'll check on him." Gus rose, his hand resting on the axe he'd set by the hearth. "I'll go with you." "No need," William replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Stay here and keep the fire going." Gus scowled but sat back down. William opened the door, stepping out into the storm. The cold hit him like a wall, the wind biting through his coat as he pulled it tighter. Snow swirled around him, reducing visibility to just a few feet. He called out, "Kyle!" No answer. William followed the faint trail of footprints leading away from the cabin, his rifle at the ready. The snow had already begun to fill them in, and he had to hurry before the storm erased them entirely. The prints led toward the edge of the tree line, then stopped abruptly. Something wasn't right. William scanned the area, his sharp eyes picking out faint signs in the snow. A disturbance, a struggle, blood. His stomach tightened as he followed the red-streaked snow to a shallow drift. Kyle's body lay half-buried, his face frozen in a mask of terror. His coat was shredded, deep gashes tearing through the fabric and flesh beneath. The snow around him was soaked crimson. William crouched, his hunter's instincts taking over as he examined the scene. The wounds were unlike anything he'd seen from a wolf or bear. The claw marks were too deep, too precise. And the teeth marks, they were enormous. He rose, his rifle gripped tightly. The storm seemed to close in around him, the wind carrying faint echoes he couldn't place. He took one last look at Kyle's lifeless body before turning back toward the cabin. Inside, the others waited, their faces pale as William stepped through the door. "He's dead," William said, his voice cold. "Something out there killed him." The cabin was silent as William's words hung in the air. The fire's crackle was the only sound, an eerie contrast to the storm's ferocity outside. Gus stood, his face pale but his voice loud and sharp. "What the hell do you mean something killed him? What did you see?" William removed his coat and set his rifle back across his lap. Claw marks, deep ones bigger than any animal I've seen around here. Teeth, too, large enough to tear through bone like it was nothing. Rachel gasped, her hands clasping tightly together. "Are you saying it was a bear?" William shook his head. "Not a bear. Bears don't kill like this. They maul, they rip. This was precise, deliberate." Sam leaned forward, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "I told you," he said, his voice gravelly. "The moon calls things out here, things that ain't natural." "Not this again," Gus snapped, his fists clenched. "You don't know that. It could have been a pack of wolves. They get desperate in storms like this." "I didn't see wolf tracks," William said evenly. "Whatever it was, it's big, strong, and it's close." The room fell into uneasy silence again. Rachel finally spoke, her voice trembling. "What do? We can't just stay here and wait for it to come after us." William straightened, his tone steady and commanding. "We barricade the cabin, make it harder for anything to get in. Gus, take that axe and fortify the door. Rachel, gather anything we can use to cover the windows. Sam, keep the fire going. We'll need the light." "What about you?" Rachel asked. "I'll keep watch," William said, his voice firm. "If it comes back, I'll deal with it." The group moved to work, though tension was thick in the air. Gus hammered boards across the doorframe with muttered curses, while Rachel stacked furniture against the windows. Sam threw more wood onto the fire, his movements slow but deliberate. William positioned himself near the main window, his rifle resting on the sill. He could feel the weight of the storm pressing against the cabin, the snow piling higher by the minute. His eyes scanned the darkness beyond the glass, searching for any sign of movement. Hours passed. The fire burned low and exhaustion began to creep in. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and neither did the oppressive sense of being watched. Every gust of wind felt like a prelude to something worse. Rachel sat down near the fire, her face pale and drawn. "Do you think it's still out there?" William didn't answer immediately. His hunter's instincts told him it was. Predators didn't kill for the sake of it. They killed to eat or to eliminate threats. Whatever had taken Kyle wasn't finished. He could feel it, the same way he could feel a storm coming long before it arrived. "It's out there," William said finally, his voice low. "And it's watching us." As if on cue, the wind howled louder, rattling the cabin walls. The sound seemed almost alive, filled with malice. William tightened his grip on his rifle. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going to stop, and neither was he. The tension inside the cabin grew heavier with every passing moment. The storm outside howled with unrelenting fury, and even the fire's warmth seemed to falter under the weight of the fear gripping the group. They spoke little, their nerves too raw for conversation. Each creak of the cabin's wooden frame made them flinch. Gus leaned back against the barricaded door, his axe resting against his leg. "We can't just sit here all night," he muttered, his voice breaking the uneasy silence. "That thing's out there, and we don't even know what it is." "We don't need to know what it is," William replied, his voice calm but firm. "We just need to survive until morning." "And what if it gets in before then?" Gus shot back, his tone sharp. "It won't," William said, gripping his rifle tightly. "Not if we stay vigilant." Despite William's words, the unease in the room was palpable. Rachel sat close to the fire, her knees drawn up to her chest. Sam was perched on a stool, his eyes closed, muttering something under his breath that sounded like a prayer. Gus shifted restlessly, his irritation mounting. "I'll take the next watch," Gus announced suddenly, standing and grabbing his axe. "Might as well make myself useful." William gave him a long look, then nodded. "Fine. Stay inside the cabin. Keep an eye on the windows and doors. If you see or hear anything, wake us immediately." Gus nodded and took his position near the front window, the axe resting on his lap. The rest of the group settled into uneasy rest, though no one seemed able to fully relax. William leaned back in his chair, his rifle resting across his knees, his eyes never fully closing. The hours dragged on. The wind screamed, rattling the cabin walls, and the fire flickered weakly, casting shifting shadows across the room. Rachel eventually dozed off near the hearth, her breathing shallow and uneasy. Sam remained motionless, his muttering tapering off into silence. When William opened his eyes, the first thing he noticed was the empty chair by the window. Gus was gone. "Gus?" William called out, his voice sharp. The sound startled Rachel awake, and she sat up, her eyes wide with fear. "He was there a moment ago," she whispered, glancing toward the window. "I swear he was." William was already on his feet, his rifle in hand. The cabin's interior felt suddenly smaller, the shadows deeper. He moved to the window and peered out, but the snow was too thick to see anything beyond a few feet. The storm roared on, drowning out any sound that might have given away Gus's whereabouts. "Stay here," William ordered, his voice low but commanding. "Don't move unless I tell you." He stepped carefully through the cabin, checking every corner, every shadow. His boots creaked against the wooden floor, the sound unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence. He found no sign of Gus, only his axe, abandoned near the back door. The door was ajar, snow blowing in through the narrow gap. William's stomach tightened as he approached it, his rifle raised. The snow outside was disturbed, faint tracks leading away from the cabin and into the storm. Rachel appeared behind him, her voice trembling. "Do you think it got him?" William didn't answer immediately. His hunter's instincts were screaming at him, warning him that something was wrong. Something more than the storm, more than the tracks in the snow. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice grim, "but I intend to find out." William stared into the swirling snow outside the cabin, his mind racing. The storm obscured everything beyond a few feet, and the tracks leading away from the cabin were already beginning to vanish under the relentless snowfall. Gus's disappearance left a knot of tension in William's chest. Something was out there, something intelligent, patient, and deadly. Rachel hovered behind him, her fear palpable. "You're not thinking of going out there, are you?" William shook his head, shutting the door and locking it tight. "Not in this storm. It'd be suicide. Whatever took Gus, it'll come back." Rachel shivered, though whether from fear or the cold, William couldn't tell. She returned to the fire, stoking it to chase away the chill creeping into the cabin. Sam remained in his corner, his lips moving silently in prayer, his eyes fixed on the floor. William resumed his position near the window, his rifle resting on the sill. The storm outside was an unrelenting wall of white, but he forced himself to focus, scanning for any movement. His hunter's instincts were on high alert, every sense sharpened by years of tracking dangerous prey. Hours crawled by. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. The wind howled, its mournful wail almost sounding like a voice. William ignored it, his eyes never leaving the window. Then, out of the corner of his vision, he saw it. A pair of glowing eyes. They hovered just beyond the edge of visibility, large and unblinking, reflecting the faint light from the cabin. William froze, his breath catching in his throat. The eyes didn't move, didn't blink, just stared, locked onto the cabin with an unnatural intensity. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice barely audible. She looked up, her face pale in the firelight. "Get behind me, now." She obeyed without question, creeping closer to the wall as William adjusted his grip on the rifle. He sighted down the barrel, his heart pounding in his chest. The eyes were still there, watching, and then they moved. The figure shifted, stepping closer to the cabin, its shape emerging faintly from the storm. It was massive, its hulking frame distorted by the falling snow. William could make out the faintest hints of fur and the glint of sharp teeth as the thing crept closer, its movements slow and deliberate. William didn't wait. He fired, the rifle's crack shattering the silence and reverberating through the cabin. The flash from the muzzle lit up the room, and Rachel let out a stifled scream. When William lowered the rifle, the eyes were gone. "Did you get it?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. "I don't think so," William said, his tone grim. "It moved before I fired, He kept his rifle trained on the window, his body tense and ready. The storm outside raged on, and the cabin walls seemed to press in closer. Whatever was out there was smart, cunning, and it wasn't finished with them yet. "Stay close to the fire," he told Rachel, "and keep your eyes open." Rachel nodded, her expression one of barely contained terror. William stayed by the window, his grip on the rifle tight, his gaze fixed on the storm. He knew this wasn't over, far from it. The cabin felt smaller with each passing hour, its warmth suffocating under the weight of fear. The glowing eyes were gone, but their presence lingered like a shadow over everyone inside. The storm outside roared, relentless and unyielding, as if the world itself were trying to bury them. Rachel huddled near the fire, her knees drawn to her chest. Sam remained in his corner, staring blankly at the floorboards, his prayers having tapered into an unsettling silence. William stayed near the window, his rifle at the ready, scanning the storm for any sign of movement. The silence inside was broken by a creak, a sound too deliberate to be the storm. William turned sharply, his eyes darting toward the back of the cabin. "What was that?" Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. William held up a hand to silence her. He moved slowly toward the sound, his boots barely making a noise on the wooden floor. The firelight flickered, casting jagged shadows as he approached the corner where Sam sat. "Sam," William said quietly. The old man didn't respond. William's grip tightened on his rifle as he stepped closer. Sam's head was bowed, his long, stringy hair obscuring his face. His shoulders rose and fell in shallow, rhythmic breaths. "Sam," William repeated, louder this time. The old man finally looked up, and William froze. Sam's face was pale, almost waxy, his eyes wide and unfocused. His lips trembled as he whispered, "It's here." Before William could respond, a loud crash came from the roof, followed by the sound of scraping claws. Rachel screamed, jumping to her feet. William spun, his rifle aimed at the ceiling. "Get to the center of the room," William barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. Rachel obeyed, but Sam didn't move. He stared at the ceiling, his lips moving in silent prayer as the sounds above grew louder. Something heavy shifted across the roof, its weight causing the rafters to groan. William kept his rifle trained upward, his heart pounding in his chest. The scraping stopped suddenly, replaced by silence so profound it seemed to press against his ears. He held his breath, his finger hovering over the trigger. Then the back door slammed open. Snow and wind burst into the cabin, extinguishing the fire and plunging the room into near darkness. Rachel screamed again, scrambling toward William as he turned to face the open doorway. His eyes adjusted to the dim light, and he could just make out the shape of something retreating into the storm. "Close the door," William shouted. Rachel moved to obey, but her trembling hands fumbled with the latch. William rushed over, slamming the door shut and securing it with a heavy wooden bar. The howling wind outside seemed louder now, more insistent. Sam's voice broke the tense silence. "It's toying with us," he said, his tone flat. "It knows we're afraid." William didn't respond. His mind was racing, calculating their next move. Whatever was out there wasn't just an animal. It was something far worse, and it was hunting them. "We're not leaving this cabin," William said, his voice resolute. "Not until the storm passes, and if it comes back, we'll be ready." But deep down, he wasn't sure they would be. The cabin was plunged into tense silence once more, save for the howling storm outside and the faint groan of the roof beam straining under the weight of snow. William stood near the door, his rifle at the ready, his eyes scanning the shadows. The fire had died, leaving only faint embers, and the cold crept into the room like a predator of its own. Rachel huddled in the center of the cabin, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Sam remained by the wall, his muttering growing louder, more frantic. His words were incoherent, a mix of prayer and gibberish that only heightened the oppressive atmosphere. William's voice cut through the tension. "We need light." He gestured toward the fireplace. "Rachel, see if you can get it going again." Rachel nodded shakily and moved to the hearth, fumbling with the logs and embers. Her hands trembled as she worked, and William couldn't help but feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He was their only defense, their only chance of survival. The scratching returned. This time, it came from the walls. Long, deliberate scrapes that sent chills racing down William's spine. He spun toward the sound, his rifle raised. The noise moved, circling the cabin, a predator testing its prey. Rachel froze, her eyes wide with terror as the scratching grew louder. "It's trying to get in," she whispered, barely audible. William moved toward the sound, his boots creaking against the wooden floor. He followed the noise, his rifle trained on the walls, ready to fire at the first sign of movement. His senses were razor sharp, his hunter's instincts screaming that danger was imminent. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. Then Sam laughed. It was a low, guttural sound, completely out of place and utterly unnerving. William turned to find the old man staring at him, his lips curled into a twisted grin. "What's so funny?" William asked, his voice cold and steady. Sam's laughter faded, and he shook his head. "You don't see it, do you? You don't know what you are." William frowned, his grip tightening on his rifle. "What are you talking about?" Sam didn't answer. Instead, his eyes rolled back and he slumped forward, his body limp. Rachel gasped, rushing toward him, but William stopped her with a sharp motion. "Stay back," he ordered. Before he could inspect Sam, the door exploded inward. Snow and wind roared into the cabin, and with it came the creature. It was massive, its hulking frame filling the doorway. Its fur was matted with blood and snow, its glowing eyes locked onto William with an intelligence that sent a shiver through him. Its jaws were lined with jagged teeth, its claws glinting in the dim light. William didn't hesitate. He fired, the crack of the rifle deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet struck the creature's shoulder, and it let out a guttural roar, recoiling but not retreating. It lunged forward, its claws swiping through the air. William dove to the side, rolling to his feet and firing again. The second shot hit its chest, but the beast barely flinched. It turned its attention to Rachel, who was frozen in terror near the hearth. "No!" William shouted, drawing his sidearm. He fired rapidly, the gunshots echoing like thunder, driving the creature back toward the doorway. It snarled, its glowing eyes narrowing before it retreated into the storm once more. The door slammed shut behind it, leaving the cabin eerily silent. Rachel collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. William stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving, his rifle still trained on the door. The creature was gone, for now, but William knew it would return. The cabin felt hollow in the aftermath of the attack. Snow swirled through the open door before Rachel, trembling and pale, managed to close and latch it. She slumped against the frame, her breaths shallow and ragged. The fire had died completely, leaving the room dimly lit by the faint glow of the storm seeping through cracks in the walls. William stood motionless, his rifle still trained on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He replayed the encounter in his mind, every movement, every detail of the creature. His shots had landed true, but the beast's resilience was unnatural, its intelligence unsettling. Rachel's sobs broke the silence. "We're going to die here," she whispered, her voice cracked and uneven. "No, we're not," William said firmly, though the doubt clawed at him. "We just need to hold out until morning." Sam's lifeless form caught William's attention. The old man hadn't moved since his strange outburst. William crouched beside him, shaking his shoulder gently. "Sam?" No response. The old man's skin was cold, his breathing shallow. William pulled back his collar and froze. There on Sam's neck were deep, jagged claw marks, hidden beneath layers of grime and old clothing. Blood seeped from the fresh wounds, staining his shirt. "He's been marked," William said grimly, standing and turning to Rachel. "It must have happened when the creature came through the door." Rachel's wide eyes locked on the old man. "Is he infected? Can he turn into one of those things?" "I don't know," William admitted, "but we can't risk it." Sam stirred then, his eyes fluttering open. "You don't understand," he croaked, his voice barely audible. "It's not me you should fear." "What are you talking about?" William demanded, leaning closer. "What do you know?" Sam's lips trembled, his breath shallow. The storm, the beast, it's drawn to one of us. William narrowed his eyes. What do you mean, one of us? You, Sam whispered, his gaze locking onto William's. You brought it here. The words hit William like a blow. He recoiled, staring at the old man as Rachel's fearful gaze turned to him. That's impossible, William said, his voice firm. I've been tracking it, fighting it. I'm not. His voice trailed off as fragments of memory surfaced. The missing time between watches, the brief blackouts he'd attributed to exhaustion, the strange primal connection he felt to the beast. His stomach turned as the truth clawed its way into his consciousness. No, William whispered, his grip tightening on his rifle. That's not possible. Sam gave a weak laugh, his head lolling to the side. You'll see. When the moon is at its highest, you'll see. Rachel stepped back, her hands trembling as she reached for the fire poker. William, is it true? Are you one of them? I don't know, William said, his voice barely audible, but deep down he feared he did. The silence in the cabin was deafening, broken only by the howling wind outside. William stood frozen, his rifle hanging loosely in his hands. Rachel kept her distance, clutching the fire poker like a lifeline. Her eyes darted between William and Sam's lifeless form, her terror barely contained. I don't remember, William said, his voice low and uneven. I've been blacking out. It doesn't make sense. Rachel took a step back, her knuckles white against the iron poker. It makes too much sense, William. You're connected to it, aren't you? That's why it keeps coming back. He wanted to deny it, to argue, but the pieces were falling into place, fitting together in ways he couldn't ignore. He had been bitten sometime during his hunt. Lost and dazed, he had wandered into the cabin, bringing the beast with him. Now, as the full moon blazed in the sky, he could feel its loud hum. He was going to turn into that thing, the blackouts. Had he killed Gus? He turned away from Rachel, his heart pounding. I didn't know, William murmured, his voice barely audible. I swear, I didn't know. Rachel's voice wavered. What happens now? William didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he moved to the cabin's small desk, where a stack of yellowed paper sat beside a worn fountain pen. He dropped into the creaking chair and began to write, his hands trembling as he put the night into words. Each sentence was a confession, a chronicle of his growing realization. I came here as a hunter. I thought I was tracking a beast. I thought I was protecting the others. I was wrong. He glanced at Rachel, who watched him warily from the far side of the room. She didn't look at him like a person anymore. The beast isn't just stalking us. It's a part of me. I can feel it now, stirring beneath my skin, waiting for the moon to call it forward. I thought I was the solution. I've been the problem all along. His pen hesitated as the storm outside seemed to wail louder, almost celebratory. He could feel the pull of the moon now, a magnetic force that made his blood boil and his senses sharpen. His reflection in the frost-coated window caught his eye. His pupils were too wide, his teeth too sharp. I need you to leave, William said suddenly, his voice startling Rachel. What? She stammered, gripping the poker tighter. Take whatever you can carry. Get out of here. I'll stay. I'll keep it here. He looked up at her, his expression filled with a mix of determination and guilt. It's the only way you'll survive. Rachel hesitated, then moved toward the door, her movements quick but cautious. She paused, her hand on the latch, and looked back at him. What will you do? William glanced at the journal. I'll finish this. Someone needs to know what happened here. She didn't say anything else. The door opened and the storm swallowed her. William hoped she would survive. William returned to the journal, his hand steady now as he wrote his final words. If you find this, know that I stayed. Know that I fought, but also know that when the moon rises, this cabin and this whole area is not safe. You might run into something like me. As the moonlight broke through the cracks in the walls, William set the pen down. His body began to tremble, the transformation starting. He closed his eyes and let the beast take over. The next morning, the cabin was empty, the snow stained with blood. And on the desk, the journal remained, waiting for the next traveler to find it. When I was a kid, my family and I moved around a lot. My parents had jobs that required them to relocate frequently, and it seemed like every year we'd pack up our lives and head to a new town, a new state, and a new house. It wasn't easy making friends or getting used to new schools, but I adapted. I guess you could say it made me resilient, though I often felt like a perpetual outsider. One of those houses stood out more than the others. We lived there for a brief period, but the memories of it are as vivid as if they happened yesterday. It was an old, Victorian-style house, the kind that you might see in a horror movie. I remember the high ceilings, the creaky wooden floors, and the large windows that always seemed to let in a bit too much light during the day, making the shadows inside even darker. I was about 8 years old when we lived there. The house was in a small, quiet town. My parents were excited about it because it was a significant upgrade from the cramped apartments we were used to. Despite its charm, there was something unsettling about the place. Even at that young age, I could sense it. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the walls themselves held on to old secrets. I spent most of my time in my room, playing with toys or reading books. I remember my parents always being busy, but they were happier there than I'd ever seen them. Still, there were odd moments that I couldn't explain. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps in the hallway at night, but when I opened my door, no one was there. Other times I felt a cold breeze, even though all the windows were shut tight. My curiosity for the unexplained started around that time. I began to seek out stories and movies about ghosts, aliens, and anything paranormal. It was my way of making sense of the odd experiences I couldn't quite put into words. This curiosity only grew as I got older, eventually leading me to the darker corners of the internet. The dark web fascinated me. It was a place where you could find anything, from conspiracy theories to obscure books and documents. I knew it was dangerous, but the allure of uncovering hidden truths was too strong to resist. I spent countless hours browsing through forums and blogs, absorbing every piece of information I could find. One evening, while my parents were out, I stumbled upon a particularly eerie website. It was a paranormal blog filled with accounts of hauntings, possessions, and other supernatural phenomena. The stories were disturbing yet captivating, each one pulling me deeper into the rabbit hole. I didn't realize it then, but this blog would soon lead me back to a chapter of my life I thought I'd left behind. The more I read, the more I felt a growing sense of unease. It was like a dark cloud settling over me, bringing with it a chill that no amount of blankets could warm. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would force me to confront the shadows of my past. A few weeks ago, during one of my regular dark web browsing sessions, I came across a link that caught my eye. It was buried deep within a forum dedicated to conspiracy theories and obscure supernatural events. The link led to a blog titled Phantom Echoes. The name alone was enough to pique my interest. The blog was a treasure trove of paranormal stories, with entries dating back over a decade. Each post detailed chilling accounts of ghost sightings, haunted objects, and mysterious disappearances. I was hooked instantly, reading entry after entry, each one more disturbing than the last. As I scrolled through the posts, one particular entry stopped me dead in my tracks. The title read, "The House of Echoes, A Dark History." The accompanying photo was a grainy image of a house that looked hauntingly familiar. I clicked on the post, my heart pounding in my chest. The article described an old Victorian house located in a small, quiet town. It was the same house my family and I had lived in over a decade ago. My mind raced as I read on. The author detailed the house's dark history, claiming it had been the site of numerous strange occurrences and supernatural events. According to the blog, the house had once belonged to a cult that operated in the late 19th century. The cult members were rumored to have performed bizarre and sinister rituals, attempting to summon spirits, demons, and even the devil himself. The blog recounted stories from previous residents who experienced inexplicable phenomena: disembodied voices, doors slamming shut on their own, sudden drops in temperature, and an overwhelming sense of malevolent energy. As I absorbed the information, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The blog's details brought back memories I had long buried. I remembered the footsteps at night, the cold breezes, and the odd looks my parents sometimes exchanged. It all started to make a twisted kind of sense. I scrolled down to the comments section, hoping to find more clues. Many commenters shared their own encounters with the house, each story adding another layer of dread. One comment, in particular, stood out. It was from someone who claimed to have lived in the house just a few years before we did. They described experiencing the same eerie phenomena and eventually moving out due to the escalating disturbances. As I sat there, staring at the screen, a flood of emotions washed over me: fear, curiosity, and a strange sense of nostalgia. The house I once called home was now a subject of dark fascination for strangers on the internet. It was a surreal and unsettling revelation. I knew I had to delve deeper. There were too many unanswered questions, too many pieces of the puzzle still missing. The blog had reopened a chapter of my life I thought was closed, and now I was determined to uncover the truth about the House of Echoes. My curiosity now fully piqued. I spent the next few nights diving deeper into the blog and other sources to uncover more about the house's history. The more I read, the more sinister the story became. The house, as it turned out, had a much darker past than I had ever imagined. According to multiple sources, the house was built over 150 years ago by a wealthy but reclusive family. The family was rumored to be involved in occult practices, and it wasn't long before whispers of strange activities began to circulate among the townspeople. Neighbors reported hearing chanting late at night and seeing strange symbols painted on the walls of the house. Some even claimed to see shadowy figures moving about inside, long after the family had retired for the evening. The cult, it seemed, was obsessed with contacting the supernatural. They performed elaborate rituals, aiming to summon spirits, demons, and even the devil himself. These rituals often involved blood sacrifices, both animal and human, and were said to be conducted in a secret underground chamber beneath the house. As I delved further, I found testimonies from various people who had lived in the house over the years. Each account painted a picture of escalating horror. One former resident recounted how their family had moved in, excited by the house's historic charm, only to flee in terror months later. They spoke of cold spots that would appear out of nowhere, doors that would slam shut without warning, and a pervasive sense of being watched. Another account was from a young couple who had lived there briefly. They described waking up in the middle of the night to find the walls bleeding and hearing whispers that seemed to come from the very foundations of the house. They also mentioned seeing ghostly apparitions of the cult members, dressed in dark robes, performing their rituals in the dead of night. I couldn't help but recall my own experiences in the house. The footsteps at night, the cold breezes, the odd looks from my parents. It all started to make a twisted kind of sense. I remembered asking my mother about the noises I heard and her dismissive smiles, as if she knew something she wasn't telling me. One particularly chilling entry detailed the death of a young girl who had lived in the house in the early 1900s. She had reportedly been possessed by a demon, her body contorted in unnatural ways, her eyes black as coal. The family's attempts to exorcise her had only made things worse, and she eventually died under mysterious circumstances. Her restless spirit was said to haunt the house to this day. These stories were disturbing enough on their own, but what made them even more unsettling was the fact that they mirrored my own experiences in that house. I had always felt a presence there, something malevolent lurking just out of sight. Now I had a name for it: the House of Echoes. With each new piece of information, my fear grew, but so did my determination to uncover the truth. What had really happened in that house? And why did my parents never speak of it? The blog had opened a door to the past, and I was determined to walk through it, no matter where it led. The deeper I went into the house's history, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that my family knew more than they ever let on. It wasn't just the cold spots and whispers that lingered in my mind. It was the memories of those nights when I was awakened by loud banging and screaming from downstairs. I remember those nights vividly. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding in my chest. The sounds were unmistakable, loud, violent, and terrifying. I would crawl out of bed, tiptoe to the top of the stairs, and listen. The sounds would stop as abruptly as they began, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. When I mustered the courage to ask my mom about it, she would always smile that strange, knowing smile and say, "What sounds, sweetie? You must have been dreaming." But I knew I wasn't dreaming. The fear was too real, the sounds too clear. One particularly disturbing memory stood out. It was a stormy night, and the wind howled outside, rattling the old windows. I was awakened by the now familiar banging and screaming. But this time, there was something different. A voice. A deep, guttural voice chanting in a language I couldn't understand. I crept to the top of the stairs and peered down, straining to hear. The voice grew louder, more insistent, and I could see a faint light flickering from under the door to the basement. My small body was paralyzed with fear. I wanted to run to my parents' room, but I couldn't move. The chanting reached a fever pitch, and then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The light went out, and the house was plunged into silence. The next morning, I asked my mom again about the noises. This time, her smile faltered for a split second before she reassured me that it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind. But now, with everything I had learned, I couldn't help but wonder if she was hiding something. Were my parents somehow involved in the house's dark history? Or were they just as much victims of its malevolent presence as the previous residents? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that they never seemed comfortable talking about our time in that house. It was as if they wanted to forget it ever happened. I decided to confront my parents about it. I called them one evening, my hands trembling as I dialed the number. My mom answered, her voice cheerful as always, but I could sense a slight edge to it when I mentioned the house. I asked her directly about the noises, the cold spots, and the strange occurrences. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "We never wanted to worry you, but yes, there were things that happened in that house. Things we couldn't explain. We tried to protect you from it, but it seems the house had other plans." I pressed her for more details, but she refused to elaborate. She just kept repeating that they had done what they thought was best. My dad, when I spoke to him, was even more evasive. He simply said, "Some things are better left in the past." Their cryptic responses only fueled my determination to get to the bottom of the mystery. There had to be more to the story, something they were too afraid to reveal. The House of Echoes had left its mark on all of us, and I was beginning to realize that escaping its grasp was not as simple as moving away. The shadows of the past were closing in, and I knew I had to find the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. After my unsettling conversation with my parents, I found myself consumed by a mix of confusion and determination. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, and I needed to put them together. The house, my parents' evasiveness, and the dark web blog all pointed to something sinister. I spent sleepless nights revisiting the blog, poring over every detail, and searching for more information. One night, as I was scrolling through the comments on the House of Echoes entry, I noticed a new reply from someone claiming to be a paranormal investigator. They had been researching the house for years and offered to share their findings with anyone interested. Without hesitation, I reached out to them, desperate for any information that could shed light on my experiences. The investigator, who went by the pseudonym Spectre, responded quickly. We arranged a video call, and I found myself staring at a middle-aged man with intense eyes and a serious demeanor. He wasted no time getting to the point. "The house you lived in is infamous in paranormal circles," Spectre began. "The cult that once resided there conducted rituals that left a permanent mark on the property. People have reported everything from ghostly apparitions to poltergeist activity." I shared my own experiences, and Spectre listened intently. When I mentioned the chanting and the light from the basement, his expression grew even graver. "That matches the accounts of several other residents," he said. "The basement was where the cult conducted their most dangerous rituals. It's possible that they opened a portal to another realm, allowing malevolent entities to enter our world." His words sent a chill down my spine. It was one thing to read about the house's dark history, but hearing it confirmed by an expert made it all the more real. I asked him if there was any way to close the portal or cleanse the house, but he shook his head. "The damage done by the cult is likely irreversible," Spectre explained. "The best thing you can do is avoid the house and try to move on. However, given your personal connection, it might be wise to seek out a professional medium or exorcist to protect yourself and your family from any lingering effects." After our conversation, I felt a mix of relief and dread. I finally had answers, but they only raised more questions. What exactly had my parents experienced, and why were they so reluctant to discuss it? Had we narrowly escaped something far worse than we realized? I decided to post my story on Reddit, hoping that others might have insights or similar experiences to share. Here I am now, pouring my heart out to strangers on the internet, searching for clarity. This is where you, Reddit, come in. Have any of you encountered anything like this? Do you have any advice on how to deal with the lingering fear and confusion? I'm lost, and I don't know what to think anymore. The House of Echoes still haunts my dreams, and the mystery feels far from solved. Please, if you have any thoughts or experiences, share them. I need to understand what happened in that house and how to finally put it behind me. I've always had a fascination with the dark web. You know, that hidden part of the internet where anonymity reigns, and you can find the most obscure, sometimes downright disturbing things. It's like a digital Wild West, a place where you can explore without boundaries, but also a place where danger lurks in every shadow. I've been diving into this underworld for years, always with a sense of caution and thrill. My journey into the dark web started back in college. I was a computer science major, and like most of my peers, I was curious about everything the internet had to offer. But while they were busy with social media and gaming, I was drawn to the enigmatic and forbidden. I remember the first time I accessed a hidden service using Tor. It was like stepping into a parallel universe. The forums, marketplaces, and chat rooms all had this eerie, clandestine vibe. It was exhilarating. Over the years, I became quite adept at navigating this digital abyss. I learned how to keep my identity hidden, using VPNs, pseudonyms, and never revealing personal information. I stuck to the cardinal rules: never use your real name, never give out your address, and never, under any circumstances, let your guard down. The anonymity of the dark web was both a shield and a sword. It allowed me to explore without fear, but it also meant that any slip-up could lead to serious consequences. Despite the risks, I was hooked. The dark web was a treasure trove of hidden knowledge and bizarre curiosities. I would spend hours on end, reading through conspiracy theories, hacker tutorials, and even some of the more sinister forums where people shared stories of the macabre. It was like an endless rabbit hole, and I was Alice, always eager to see how deep it went. One of my favorite activities was browsing the various marketplaces. These were not your typical online stores. They sold everything from rare books and obscure memorabilia to more illicit items like counterfeit money and hacked databases. I never bought anything illegal, but I loved the thrill of window shopping in this lawless digital bazaar. The vendors often had fascinating stories, and the reviews were a mix of genuine testimonials and bizarre, often hilarious anecdotes. I prided myself on my ability to stay safe. I followed all the security protocols religiously, and I never took unnecessary risks. But there's one thing about the dark web that even the most cautious users can't control: the unpredictability of other people. You never really know who's on the other side of the screen, or what their intentions might be. It was a chilly October evening when my luck ran out. I was perusing one of my usual forums, a place where users exchange tips and tricks for staying anonymous. A new thread caught my eye. Someone was selling a supposedly foolproof method for remaining untraceable. Intrigued, I clicked on the link. It led me to a private chat with the seller, who went by the handle Shadowstalker. Shadowstalker seemed knowledgeable and friendly. He explained the method in detail, and I was impressed by his expertise. We chatted for a while, and he even shared some useful scripts and tools. Everything seemed legit, and I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary, but looking back, I realized that was the moment I let my guard down. A few days later, I started noticing strange things. My computer was running slower than usual, and there were unfamiliar processes running in the background. I did a thorough scan for malware, but nothing came up. I shrugged it off as a glitch and continued with my usual dark web escapades. Then one night, as I was scrolling through a forum, I saw it, a post with my full name and address. My heart skipped a beat. There it was, in black and white, for everyone to see. My personal information, exposed to the darkest corners of the internet. Panic set in. How had this happened? I had always been so careful. I quickly shut down my computer and disconnected from the internet. My mind was racing. Had I been hacked? Had someone tracked me down through my interactions with Shadowstalker? I couldn't be sure, but one thing was clear: my worst nightmare had come true. My identity had been compromised, and there was no telling what might happen next. I sat in the dark, my heart pounding, replaying every online interaction in my mind. How could I have been so careless? The thrill of the dark web had turned into a living nightmare, and I had no idea how to fix it. All I could do was wait and hope that the storm would pass, but deep down I knew that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't even imagine. The moment I saw my personal information laid bare on that dark web forum, a paralyzing fear gripped me. I shut off my computer, yanked the Ethernet cable out, and turned off my phone. For the first time in years, I felt truly exposed. I turned off all the lights in my room and sat in the darkness, trying to calm my racing mind. I kept thinking about the steps I took to protect myself. I had followed every security measure to the letter, but now, with my identity compromised, it felt like my fortress had crumbled. Each creak of the house made me jump, and the shadows in my room seemed to grow longer and more sinister. Sleep was impossible that night. I sat on my bed, clutching my phone, debating whether to call the police. But what would I tell them? That I had been messing around on the dark web, and now my personal information was out there. It sounded absurd, even to me. The fear of being judged or laughed at kept me from making the call. The next morning, the fear hadn't subsided. I unplugged my computer, packed it away, and decided to lay low for a while. I avoided going online altogether, not just the dark web, but even regular browsing. I didn't want to risk being tracked or monitored. My paranoia was at an all-time high. Every unfamiliar face on the street looked like a potential threat. Every phone call from an unknown number sent chills down my spine. For the next few days, I barely left my house. I kept the curtains drawn and the doors locked. I even taped over my webcam, just in case. The isolation was suffocating, but the fear of what might happen if I went outside was even worse. Every night I lay awake, listening for any unusual sounds, half expecting someone to break down my door. Nothing happened. No strange phone calls, no suspicious emails, no unmarked vans parked outside my house. The silence was both a relief and a source of anxiety. Was it possible that this was just a cruel prank? Or was the real danger still looming, waiting for the right moment to strike? The paranoia was eating away at me. I knew I couldn't live like this forever, but I had no idea what to do next. I was trapped in a state of constant dread, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I tried to distract myself with mundane tasks, cleaning the house, organizing my books, anything to keep my mind occupied. But the fear was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. On the fourth day, I decided to reconnect my computer, but only to check my emails and see if there were any signs of trouble. I used a different network and took every precaution to stay hidden. As I logged in, my heart pounded in my chest. The inbox was filled with the usual spam and newsletters, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I noticed an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read, "You can't hide." I hesitated before opening it. My hands were shaking as I clicked on the message. Inside was a single line of text. "We know who you are and we know where you live." My stomach dropped. This wasn't over. Far from it. The fear that had been gnawing at me for days now had a clear, undeniable target. The threat was real, and I was in its crosshairs. After receiving the ominous email, my paranoia soared to new heights. I considered moving, changing my name, or even going off the grid entirely. But these drastic measures seemed impractical and nearly impossible to execute. I decided to stay vigilant, monitor any unusual activities, and hope that this was just an empty threat. The first package arrived a few days later. It was an ordinary-looking brown box with no return address. My heart sank when I saw it on my doorstep. The rational part of me wanted to believe it was just a misdelivery, but deep down, I knew it was connected to my recent dark web nightmare. I brought the box inside with trembling hands, contemplating whether to open it. After an agonizing few minutes, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a knife and cautiously sliced through the tape. Inside, nestled among packing peanuts, was a small, blackened doll with hollow eyes. It looked handmade and crude, but its presence was undeniably sinister. A chill ran down my spine. The doll felt like a message, a tangible representation of the threats I'd received. I quickly resealed the box and threw it in the trash. I tried to convince myself it was a prank, something to scare me into submission, but the anxiety gnawed at me, refusing to let go. Over the next few days, more packages arrived, each one more disturbing than the last. One contained a series of photographs of my house taken from various angles and distances. Another held a cryptic note with a single word: "Soon." The final straw was a box that contained a butcher knife, its blade stained with a red paint. I don't think it was blood, but still enough to scare me a lot. I began to feel like a prisoner in my own home, constantly looking over my shoulder and jumping at every sound. The packages were relentless, a steady reminder that I was being watched and hunted. The fear and stress were overwhelming, pushing me to the edge of sanity. One evening, as I was tossing yet another unsettling package into the trash, I noticed a black car parked across the street. Two men in black suits were sitting inside, their eyes fixed on me. Panic surged through my body. These weren't ordinary pranksters. They were professionals. My fear had turned into a horrifying reality. I decided to go to the police. Despite my reservations and the potential for ridicule, I had no other choice. I needed help. When I explained my situation to the officer on duty, he listened with a skeptical expression. As soon as I mentioned the dark web, his demeanor changed to one of thinly veiled amusement. "We'll look into it," he said, handing me a case number. But his tone made it clear that he didn't take me seriously. As I left the station, I felt more alone than ever. The people who were supposed to protect me thought I was either crazy or lying. It was up to me to figure out how to escape this nightmare. Back at home, I pulled the curtains tight and double-checked the locks. I needed a plan, some way to disappear without a trace. The men in black suits were still out there, and I had no doubt they were waiting for the right moment to make their move. I couldn't let that happen. I had to outsmart them, to find a way to vanish before it was too late. The moment I noticed those men in black suits, my sense of safety shattered completely. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, to escape before something terrible happened. The police had been no help, so I was on my own. I resolved to get rid of the disturbing packages without opening them. Every day I would find another box on my doorstep, and every day I would toss it, unopened, into the trash. But the men in black suits were a different story. They were always there, watching me from their car or following me from a distance when I went out. It felt like I was living in a spy thriller, except this was my real life, and the danger was palpable. My paranoia grew with each passing hour. I started taking different routes to work, varying my schedule, anything to throw them off. But no matter what I did, they were always there, a constant, ominous presence. One evening, I decided enough was enough. I needed to confront them, to make them understand that I was aware of their surveillance. With my heart pounding, I walked up to their car, my fists clenched, ready to demand answers. But as soon as they saw me approach, they sped off, leaving me standing there, feeling more helpless than ever. I returned home and knew I couldn't keep living like this. The stress was unbearable, and the fear of what might happen next was paralyzing. I realized my only option was to disappear. I had a cousin in Spain, someone I could trust and who lived far enough away to provide a safe haven. I packed a bag, booked a flight, and left my apartment under the cover of darkness, hoping that this desperate move would throw them off my trail. In Spain, I finally started to breathe a little easier. My cousin welcomed me with open arms, and I spent the next few months trying to piece my life back together. The warm sun and relaxed pace of life were a stark contrast to the constant fear and anxiety I had left behind. For the first time in weeks, I slept soundly, but even in this peaceful setting, I remained cautious. I used a new name, avoided social media, and stayed away from anything that might link me back to my old life. The distance and time helped, and slowly the paranoia began to fade. When I finally felt ready, I moved to a different apartment back in my home country, one that was unconnected to my previous address. I kept my guard up, but allowed myself to hope that the worst was behind me. The packages stopped coming, and the men in black suits were nowhere to be seen. It seemed that my drastic measures had worked. I had slipped through their fingers, and for now, the nightmare was over. Settling into my new apartment felt like a fresh start. The months I had spent in Spain had given me time to think, to plan, and to gather the courage to move forward. My new place was small but cozy, located in a quiet neighborhood far from my old life. I took every precaution to stay under the radar: no social media, a new email address, and a carefully curated routine to avoid drawing attention. The first few weeks were tense. I was hypervigilant, constantly looking over my shoulder and double-checking the locks on my doors and windows. But as time passed without incident, I slowly began to relax. The haunting memories of the dark web and the men in black suits started to fade, replaced by a growing sense of normalcy. I found a job at a local bookstore, a quiet and unassuming place where I could lose myself in the comfort of books. The staff were friendly, and the regular customers soon became familiar faces. It was the perfect environment to help me rebuild my life. I even started to make new friends, though I kept my past a closely guarded secret. Despite the newfound peace, a part of me remained vigilant. I never fully let go of the fear that had gripped me for so long. Every time I saw a black car or an unfamiliar face, my heart would skip a beat. But nothing ever came of it. The packages had stopped, the men in suits had disappeared, and the dark web was a part of my past I never intended to revisit. Months turned into a year, and the nightmare that had once consumed my life became a distant memory. I allowed myself to believe that I had finally escaped, that I was safe. I started to make long-term plans, considering a return to school or perhaps even moving to a new city to continue my fresh start. Then one evening, as I was closing up the bookstore, I found a small plain envelope in my mailbox. My hands trembled as I opened it, fearing the worst. Inside was a single piece of paper with a simple message: "We never forget." The fear that had subsided came rushing back. I realized that no matter how far I ran, No matter how well I hid, the shadows of the dark web would always be there, lurking just out of sight. But this time, I was prepared. I had learned to live with the fear, to use it as a reminder to stay vigilant and protect myself. I burned the note and resolved to continue living my life, cautiously but defiantly. The dark web had taught me a hard lesson, but it had also shown me the strength I never knew I had. I would always carry the scars of that experience, but I refused to let them define me. I've always been a curious person. Ever since I was a kid, I had this habit of poking around where I wasn't supposed to, like when I found my dad's old box of VHS tapes hidden in the attic. It turned out to be nothing but old baseball games, but that thrill of discovering something secret stuck with me. That same curiosity followed me into adulthood, but it wasn't dusty attics I was exploring anymore. It was the dark web. Now, before you judge, let me explain. I wasn't there to buy anything illegal or to engage in anything sketchy. It was just that same childhood urge to see what was out there, to understand the things that most people wouldn't dare to look at. The dark web was like this mysterious attic for the digital age, full of hidden corners and forbidden things, and I wanted to know more. I'd been browsing through some forums, nothing too crazy, mostly tech discussions, weird conspiracy theories, and some urban legends. It was like walking through a bad neighborhood in the middle of the night. You know you shouldn't be there, but the adrenaline keeps you going. One evening, I stumbled upon a chat room that caught my attention. The title was vague, something like Underground Connections, which didn't tell me much, but it had a lot of active users, which meant something interesting had to be going on. I joined under a throwaway username, something generic that wouldn't tie back to me. At first, it was all pretty mundane. People were talking about VPNs, sharing links to news articles that wouldn't make it to mainstream media, and some were exchanging tips on how to stay anonymous online. But then, the conversation shifted when someone posted a message in all caps, "Who wants to see the real dark web?" I wasn't sure what they meant by that. The whole place was supposed to be the dark web, right? But there was something about the way it was phrased that got me. The chat exploded with people asking what they meant. I stayed silent, just watching the messages scroll by, waiting to see where this was going. The original poster, who called themselves Deep Dive 88, didn't respond to the flood of questions immediately. After a few minutes, they posted again, "If you're serious, DM me." I hesitated. I was curious, but this seemed different, more intense. But then that nagging curiosity kicked in, and before I could overthink it, I sent a private message. "Hey, what's this about?" The reply came almost instantly. "Not here. Too many eyes. You want in or not?" Again, I hesitated. But this was why I was here, right? To explore, to see the things others wouldn't. "Yeah, I'm in," I typed back. "Good. Stay in the chat room. I'll send a link in 10 minutes. Click it. But only if you're ready to see things you can't unsee." I felt a pit in my stomach. This was way beyond the usual lurking and browsing. This was an invitation to something much darker. But I was in too deep now to back out. I watched the clock, each minute feeling like an hour. My palms started sweating as I waited. Part of me hoped that Deep Dive 88 would forget about me. But at exactly 10 minutes, a new message appeared in the chat room. It was a link. The chat room went wild, with everyone demanding to know what it was. But there were no explanations, just that single ominous link. I stared at it, my finger hovering over the mouse, nerves fraying with every passing second. And then I clicked it. The screen went black for a moment, and I thought maybe my computer had crashed. But then, slowly, an image began to load. It was a video player with no controls, just a blank screen and a loading circle spinning in the center. My heart was pounding as I waited for it to start. I had no idea what I was about to see, but I was glued to my chair, too scared to move, yet too curious to close it out. The video started with a shaky camera moving through what looked like a basement. The lighting was dim, and the walls were bare concrete. There were no voices, just the sound of footsteps echoing off the walls. The camera focused on a door at the end of a long hallway. It was a heavy, industrial-looking door with no windows, just a thick metal frame. The person behind the camera stopped in front of it, hesitated, and then slowly pushed it open. I could barely make out what was inside at first. The room was almost entirely dark, save for a single flickering fluorescent light in the corner. As the camera moved forward, I noticed something that made my breath catch. A figure sitting in a chair back facing the camera. They were tied up, motionless. The camera moved closer, circling around to the front of the chair. When the face came into view, I gasped. It was a man, blindfolded, with a strip of duct tape over his mouth. His face was gaunt, and his clothes were dirty, like he'd been there for days. I could see his chest rising and falling rapidly. He was alive, but barely. The camera zoomed in on his face, holding there for what felt like an eternity. And then suddenly the screen went black again. For a second I thought it was over, but then a message appeared on the screen, in plain white text. This is just the beginning. And then, just as quickly, the video window closed itself, and I was back on my desktop, staring at my reflection in the dark screen. My hands were shaking. What the hell had I just seen? I tried to go back to the chat room to ask, but the room had disappeared like it never existed. I couldn't even find the link in my browser history. It was just gone. That night I barely slept. I kept replaying the video in my head. The image of that man's face burned into my memory. Who was he? What happened to him? Was it even real? The more I thought about it, the more questions I had, but no answers. In the days that followed, I tried to forget about it, to chalk it up to some sick prank. But then strange things started happening. My internet connection would drop randomly, or my computer would freeze up for no reason. I started getting emails from addresses I didn't recognize, with subject lines that made no sense, just strings of random letters and numbers. I never opened them, but they kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. And then one night I got a message on my phone from an unknown number. It was just 2 words. Click here. Attached was a link. I stared at it for a long time, my finger hovering over the screen. But this time I didn't click. I wasn't ready to see what came next. But the real question is, how do you stop something once you've already let it in? After that first video, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It was like a shadow had been cast over my life, one that followed me everywhere I went. I kept trying to convince myself that it was just a creepy video, that the strange things happening were just coincidences, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I started noticing little things. My computer would turn on by itself in the middle of the night, the screen glowing in the dark room as if someone was watching me. My phone would buzz with notifications, but when I checked, there was nothing there. No missed calls, no texts, just silence. And then there were the emails. Every day, more and more of them would flood my inbox, all from untraceable addresses, all with those random strings of characters. I never opened any of them, but their mere presence was enough to keep me on edge. One evening, about a week after I clicked that link, I was sitting at my desk trying to distract myself with some work. My mind kept wandering back to that video, to the man tied to the chair. Who was he? Why did I get chosen to see it? My thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise. My phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't just a notification, it was a call. The number was blocked, of course. My first instinct was to ignore it, to let it go to voicemail. But something in me, maybe that same cursed curiosity, made me pick up. "Hello?" I said, my voice shaky. There was a moment of silence on the other end. Just when I was about to hang up, I heard it. A low, almost mechanical voice. "Are you watching?" My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" I stammered. "Check your inbox," the voice said, and then the line went dead. I sat there for a moment, staring at my phone, the words echoing in my mind. Slowly, I turned back to my computer and opened my email. Sure enough, there was a new message waiting for me. The subject line was different this time. Not the usual random characters, but something more direct. Watch now. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to delete it, to just shut down my computer and walk away. But I couldn't. I had to know what was going on, what this person or whatever it was wanted from me. I clicked on the email. Inside, there was no text, just a single link. My hand hovered over the mouse, hesitating, but eventually I clicked. The link opened a new window, and I found myself staring at another video. This one was different from the first. It wasn't shaky or dimly lit. It was clear, well lit, like something out of a home security system. The camera was pointed at a living room, ordinary enough, couch, coffee table, TV in the corner, but there was something off about it, something that made my stomach twist. It took me a moment to realize what it was. It was my living room. The camera was showing a live feed of my own house. I watched in horror as the feed zoomed in on the front door, then panned over to the window, then to the hallway leading to the room where I was sitting. I spun around in my chair, heart racing, but there was no one there, just the empty hallway, the shadows flickering in the dim light. I turned back to the screen, and that's when I saw it. The camera was moving again, this time down the hallway, towards my office, towards me. I could see the door to my office on the screen, the same door that was just a few feet away from where I was sitting. The feed zoomed in on the door handle, and I watched, paralyzed, as it slowly started to turn. I jumped out of my chair, slamming the door shut and locking it. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I pressed my ear against the door, listening for any sound, any sign that someone, or something, was on the other side. But there was nothing. Just silence. I backed away from the door, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. What was happening? How was someone watching me? And more importantly, how did they get into my house without me knowing? The video feed was still running on my computer. I forced myself to look at it, to see if there was anything else, any clue that might tell me what was going on. But the camera had stopped moving. It was just showing the closed door now, as if whoever or whatever was controlling it was waiting for me to open it. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hit the numbers. But just as I was about to press the call button, my phone screen went black. I tried turning it back on, but it was dead. No power, no response. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I needed to get out of there. I grabbed my car keys and rushed to the window. My plan was simple: get in my car and drive as far away from my house as I could. But when I pulled back the curtain, my blood ran cold. There was a car parked across the street. It wasn't just any car. It was a black SUV with tinted windows, the kind you see in movies when someone's being watched. I stared at it, my mind reeling. Had it been there all along? Had someone been watching me, not just through my computer, but from outside my house as well? I didn't know what to do. If I tried to leave, would they follow me? Was there even anyone in the car, or was it just another scare tactic? I didn't want to find out. Instead, I pulled the curtain shut and backed away from the window, my mind racing. I was trapped, and I knew it. Whatever this was, whoever was behind it, they had me exactly where they wanted me. And the worst part? I still didn't know why. The night passed in a blur of paranoia and fear. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. I kept checking the window, but the SUV never moved. My phone remained dead, and my computer screen eventually went black. I was completely cut off, isolated in my own home. When morning finally came, I mustered up the courage to leave my office. The house was eerily quiet, as if the events of the previous night had never happened. I checked every room, every closet, but there was no sign of an intruder. The front door was still locked, the windows untouched. It was like I had imagined the whole thing. But I knew I hadn't. The fear was too real, too raw, and the questions kept piling up. What was this? Some kind of sick game? A warning? Or was it something much worse? I didn't know the answers, but one thing was clear. I couldn't stay here anymore. I needed to get away, to find somewhere safe where I could figure out what was happening. But as I packed a bag and prepared to leave, one thought kept nagging at the back of my mind. What if it wasn't over? What if by clicking that link, I had opened a door that could never be closed? Leaving my house felt like stepping out of a nightmare and into another. I had no idea where to go or what to do, but I knew I couldn't stay. My car was parked in the driveway, but every step I took toward it felt like a gamble, like I was playing a dangerous game with an opponent I couldn't see. The black SUV was still there, parked across the street. I didn't know if anyone was inside, but I wasn't about to find out. I kept my head down, trying to act as normal as possible, though my heart was racing. As soon as I got into my car, I locked the doors and started the engine. The sound of the car rumbling to life was almost comforting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I pulled out of the driveway slowly, my eyes flicking back to the SUV. It didn't move, didn't follow me. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and turned onto the main road, heading out of the neighborhood. I didn't have a destination in mind, just away, as far away as I could get. As I drove, my thoughts were a jumbled mess. I replayed everything that had happened since I clicked that link. The video, the strange emails, the live feed of my own house. It all felt like some twisted nightmare, but it was real, too real. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the SUV following me, but the road behind me was empty. Eventually, I found myself on the highway, heading out of town. The morning sun was starting to rise, casting a warm glow over the landscape, but it did little to ease my anxiety. I still had no idea what I was running from, only that I needed to get as far away as possible. I drove for hours, not really paying attention to where I was going. I just wanted distance. Eventually, the city faded away, and I was surrounded by open countryside. The road stretched out in front of me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through fields and forests. It was quiet out here, peaceful even, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still in danger. I pulled into a rest stop somewhere in the middle of nowhere. It was one of those places that seemed to exist purely for people like me, travelers passing through with no real connection to the place. There was a small convenience store, a couple of vending machines, and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in weeks. I parked my car in the far corner of the lot, away from the few other vehicles that were there. I sat in the car for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. What was my next move? I couldn't go back home, that much was clear. But I couldn't just keep driving aimlessly either. I needed to figure out what was happening and why I was being targeted. But where could I go? Who could I trust? I pulled out my phone, hoping it had somehow come back to life. To my surprise, the screen lit up. I had a signal again. Relief washed over me as I unlocked it, but that relief was short-lived. As soon as I did, I saw a new notification, another message from that same unknown number. Keep running. You can't escape. My heart dropped. They knew. They knew where I was, what I was doing. How was that even possible? I hadn't seen anyone following me, hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary on the drive. But they were still watching, still tracking me. Panic started to set in again, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't afford to lose it now. I needed to be smart, to think clearly. I got out of the car and walked into the convenience store, hoping to clear my head. The place was nearly empty, just an older man behind the counter and a couple of travelers grabbing coffee. I wandered the aisles aimlessly, trying to come up with a plan. As I passed by a rack of prepaid phones, an idea struck me. I grabbed one, along with a bottle of water and some snacks, and took them to the counter. The old man barely looked up as he rang me up. I paid in cash, not wanting to leave any kind of digital trail. If they were tracking my phone, maybe this would throw them off. Back in the car, I quickly set up the new phone. It wasn't much, just a basic model, but it was something. I left my old phone on the seat, powered down, and tossed the prepaid phone into my bag. I didn't know if it would help, but it was better than nothing. I sat there for a while, trying to decide what to do next. I couldn't keep running forever, and I couldn't stay in one place for too long. But I needed answers. I thought about going to the police, but what would I even tell them? That I clicked a link on the dark web and now I was being watched. They'd think I was crazy, or worse. They'd start digging into what I was doing online. I couldn't risk that. Then I remembered something, a friend from college, Mark. We weren't close, but we kept in touch over the years. He was one of those tech-savvy guys who always seemed to know his way around the internet. If anyone could help me figure this out, it would be him. I dug through my bag for the prepaid phone and dialed his number. It rang a few times before he picked up. Hello? Mark's voice was groggy, like I'd woken him up. Mark, it's me, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I need your help. There was a pause on the other end. Hey man, what's going on? You sound freaked out. I took a deep breath and quickly explained everything. How I'd been poking around on the dark web, how I'd clicked the link, the video, the strange emails, the live feed, and now the messages telling me I couldn't escape. Mark listened in silence, and when I finished, there was another long pause. That's intense, he finally said. But are you sure this isn't just some elaborate prank? I mean, people on the dark web are known for pulling stuff like this. I don't think so, Mark. This feels different. It's like they know everything I'm doing. They even knew I was driving out of town. How could they know that? Mark was quiet again. Okay, listen, he said, his tone more serious now. First thing, you need to stop using anything that can be tracked. Your phone, your credit cards, all of it. If they're really watching you, they could be using anything to track your movements. And if you're right, and this isn't just a prank, then you need to get off the grid, at least for a little while. How do I do that? Head to a motel or something, somewhere off the beaten path. Pay in cash. Keep your head down. I'll do some digging on my end, see if I can find anything that might explain what's going on. But in the meantime, stay safe and don't trust anyone, okay? I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Okay, thanks, Mark. I owe you one. Just stay alive, man. We'll figure this out. I hung up and sat there for a moment, processing everything. It was a relief to have someone on my side, but Mark's words only reinforced how serious this was. I couldn't afford to make any more mistakes. I had to stay ahead of whoever or whatever was behind this. I started the car again and pulled out of the rest stop, heading deeper into the countryside. I didn't know where I was going, but I kept driving, hoping to find a place where I could lay low for a while. The roads became narrower, the houses fewer and farther between, until I finally spotted a small rundown motel on the side of the road. It looked like the kind of place that hadn't seen many visitors in years, which was perfect. I parked in the back, out of sight from the road, and went inside. The lobby was empty, save for an old TV playing some infomercial on low volume. The man at the front desk didn't ask any questions when I handed him cash for a room. He just slid the key across the counter with a grunt, and I took it without a word. The room was as shabby as I expected. Faded wallpaper, a lumpy bed, and a TV that looked like it hadn't worked in decades. But it was a place to hide, and that was all I needed. I sat on the bed, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I didn't know how long I'd have to stay here, but I was prepared to wait it out until Mark found something. Until then, all I could do was wait and hope that whoever was behind this wouldn't find me. But as the night wore on, and the silence of the empty motel room settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was like the walls themselves were closing in, trapping me in a nightmare that I couldn't escape from. I knew I was safe for now, But for how long? How long until they found me again? As I lay there in the darkness, trying to ignore the creeping fear that was slowly taking over, one thought kept running through my mind. What happens when you run out of places to hide? The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside the motel room window. For a brief moment, I almost convinced myself that everything was normal, that the events of the past few days had been nothing more than a bad dream. But as soon as I opened my eyes and saw the faded wallpaper, the reality of my situation hit me all over again. I hadn't heard from Mark since our conversation the day before, and that silence only fueled my anxiety. I grabbed the prepaid phone from the nightstand and checked it for any messages, but there was nothing. No updates, no new leads, just a cold, empty screen staring back at me. I spent the next few hours pacing the small room, unable to relax. The uncertainty was eating away at me, and I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. I needed answers, and I needed them soon. But every time I thought about leaving the motel, I was overwhelmed with the fear of being found. Whoever was behind this had already proven that they could track me no matter where I went, and that thought alone was enough to keep me rooted in place. Around noon, the prepaid phone finally rang, jolting me out of my thoughts. I answered it immediately, my heart pounding in my chest. "Mark?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Yeah, it's me," Mark replied, his tone serious. "I've been doing some digging, and I think I've found something, but it's not good." I swallowed hard. "What is it?" "There's a group on the dark web," Mark began, his voice lowering, as if he was afraid someone might be listening in. "They're known as the Watchers. They're not your typical hackers or scammers. They're something much worse. From what I've gathered, they target people who show too much curiosity, people who poke around where they shouldn't." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean target? What do they want?" "They don't just want your money or your identity," Mark continued. "They want control. They get inside your life, your mind, and they don't stop until you're completely broken. And from what you've told me, it sounds like you've caught their attention." I sank down onto the edge of the bed, my mind reeling. But why me? I didn't do anything. I was just curious. "That's exactly why," Mark said. "They prey on curiosity. It's like a game to them. They lure you in with something intriguing, something that feels almost harmless. But once you take the bait, they've got you. And the more you resist, the more determined they become." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. So what do I do? How do I get out of this? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I'm not sure," Mark admitted finally. "Most of the stories I've found about the Watchers don't end well. People either disappear or, worse. But there might be one way to stop them." I sat up straighter, clinging to the sliver of hope in his voice. "What is it?" "You have to find out what they want from you," Mark said. "They're not doing this for no reason. There's something they're after, something specific. If you can figure out what it is, maybe you can use it against them." "How do I do that?" I asked, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. "Go back to where it started," Mark suggested. "Back to the dark web, back to that chat room. If you can find the link again, maybe you can get some answers." The thought of going back to the dark web made my skin crawl. But Mark was right. I couldn't keep running forever. If I wanted to end this, I had to face it head on. "Okay," I said, trying to steady my voice. "I'll do it." "But what if they catch on? What if they know I'm coming?" "They already know," Mark replied grimly. "But that might work in your favor. If you confront them directly, they might slip up. Just be careful, and whatever you do, don't let them drag you in deeper." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Thanks, Mark. I don't know what I'd do without you." "Just stay safe," Mark said, "and call me as soon as you find anything." I ended the call and took a deep breath, trying to gather my courage. Going back to the dark web felt like walking into a trap, but it was the only option I had left. I needed to understand what the Watchers wanted, why they had chosen me, and how I could stop them before it was too late. I powered up my laptop, the one I'd been too afraid to use since leaving home, and connected it to the motel's sketchy Wi-Fi. My hands were trembling as I navigated back to the dark web, but I forced myself to push through the fear. The familiar black screen greeted me, and I typed in the address of the chat room where this nightmare had begun. To my surprise, the chat room was still active. The same generic usernames were scrolling by, discussing all manner of conspiracy theories and underground secrets. But there was no sign of Deep Dive 88, the person who had originally sent me the link. I scanned the messages, hoping for some clue, some mention of the Watchers, but it was just the same idle chatter. Frustrated, I started to type a message into the chat, asking if anyone knew about the Watchers or the link I had received. But before I could hit send, a new message appeared on the screen. It was from a username I didn't recognize, and it was addressed directly to me. "We've been waiting for you." My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the message, unsure of what to do. But before I could react, another message popped up. "Do you want to know the truth?" I hesitated for a moment, then typed a single word, "Yes." The response was immediate. A new link appeared in the chat, just like the one I had clicked on before. But this time it was accompanied by a message. "Click to understand." My finger hovered over the mouse. This was it, the moment of truth. I had a choice: click the link and dive deeper into the nightmare, or close the laptop and walk away, hoping that ignoring it would make it all go away. But deep down, I knew there was no turning back. I had to know what the Watchers wanted, why they had targeted me, and how I could escape their grasp. I clicked the link. The screen went black for a moment, just like before. But this time, the video that loaded was different. It wasn't shaky or low quality. It was crystal clear, as if it had been professionally filmed. The camera was moving through a familiar setting, one that made my blood run cold. It was my house. The camera moved slowly, methodically, capturing every detail of the rooms I knew so well. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway, all exactly as I had left them. But as the camera moved into my bedroom, I saw something that made my heart stop. There was someone sitting on my bed. It was me. I was sitting there staring blankly at the camera, as if in a trance. My eyes were vacant, my expression emotionless. It was like looking into a mirror, but with something terribly wrong. Then the camera zoomed in on my face, and the me in the video finally spoke. "Now you see." The video ended abruptly, leaving me staring at the black screen, my mind racing. What had I just seen? Was it real? Was I losing my mind? I couldn't make sense of it, but one thing was clear. The Watchers were far more powerful, far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. As I sat there trying to piece together what was happening, a new message appeared on the screen. "You're already part of the game. There's no escape." I slammed the laptop shut, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I could feel the walls closing in on me, the weight of the situation pressing down on my chest. The Watchers had shown me just a glimpse of their power, and it was more than I could handle. But I knew I couldn't give up. Not now. Not when I was so close to the truth. Whatever the Watchers wanted, whatever they were after, I had to find a way to stop them. I had to find a way to break free. But as I sat there in the darkness of the motel room, one question kept haunting me. How do you fight something that knows everything about you? The motel room felt like a cage. The walls seemed to close in, thick with the suffocating knowledge that no matter where I ran, the Watchers were always one step ahead. They had already shown me more than I could handle, but deep down, I knew I had to face them one last time. I couldn't keep running. Mark's words echoed in my mind. Find out what they want. It was my only shot at getting out of this nightmare. I took a deep breath and opened my laptop again, hands trembling as I powered it up. The screen flickered to life, casting an eerie glow in the dim room. I knew what I had to do. but the thought of confronting the watchers, of finding out the truth, filled me with a sense of dread I'd never experienced before. As soon as I connected to the dark web, a new message appeared on the screen. It was from the same unknown user who had sent the previous links. Ready to understand? I hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard. This was it, the moment of truth. If I answered, there would be no going back. But I had come this far. I couldn't stop now. I typed out a single word. Yes. The screen went black, and for a moment I thought my laptop had died. But then slowly, a new video began to play. This one was different from the others. It didn't show my house or any familiar surroundings. Instead, it showed a dark room, lit only by the faint glow of a computer screen. A figure sat in front of it, their face obscured by shadows. The figure leaned forward, and I felt my breath catch in my throat as they began to speak. Their voice was calm, measured, almost robotic. "You're wondering why you were chosen, aren't you?" the figure asked, their voice echoing in the dark room. "Why you, out of all the countless souls wandering the dark web, were drawn into this game?" I nodded, even though they couldn't see me. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited for the answer. "It's simple," the figure continued. "You have something we need, something that only you can provide." My mind raced, trying to make sense of their words. "What do you want from me?" I typed out quickly, desperate for answers. The figure on the screen seemed to smile, though it was hard to tell in the dim light. "Information," they said. "But not just any information. We need your mind, your thoughts, your memories. We need access to everything that makes you you." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "Why?" I asked, feeling more confused and terrified with each passing second. "Because you're a puzzle piece," the figure replied. "One small part of a much larger picture. By accessing your mind, we can complete that picture. We can see the patterns, the connections, the truths that you're not even aware of. And in return, we offer you freedom." "Freedom?" I echoed, feeling a surge of anger. "You call this freedom? You've been stalking me, manipulating me. How is that freedom?" The figure's tone remained calm, almost soothing. "You misunderstand. The freedom we offer is from yourself, from the confines of your limited perception. By allowing us to see everything, we can help you break free from the constraints of your own mind, but only if you're willing to give up control." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. They wanted to strip me of everything that made me who I was, to turn me into a blank slate, a tool for their own purposes. But something in me resisted. An instinct, a deep-seated desire to hold on to my identity, to my sense of self. "No," I typed, my hands shaking. "I won't do it. I won't give you control." The figure on the screen tilted their head, as if considering my response. "Are you sure?" they asked, their voice taking on a slightly more ominous tone. "You've seen what we're capable of. You've experienced our reach, our power. Do you really think you can escape us?" I didn't know how to answer. I was terrified, cornered, but something in me refused to back down. I couldn't let them win. I couldn't let them take away everything that made me who I was. "Maybe I can't escape," I typed, my resolve strengthening with every keystroke. "But I won't give up without a fight. I won't let you take control of my mind." The figure was silent for a moment, and I braced myself for the worst. But then, to my surprise, they began to laugh. A low, almost sinister chuckle that sent chills down my spine. "You're stronger than we thought," the figure said finally. "Most people would have given in by now, but not you. That's interesting." I didn't respond, unsure of where this was going. The figure leaned closer to the camera, their face still obscured by shadows. "Very well," they said. "If you refuse to give up control, then we'll make you an offer. Leave the dark web. Never return." If you do, we will leave you in peace, but if you ever come back, if you ever try to find us again, we will take everything from you. Your mind, your memories, your life. Do you understand? I hesitated, my heart racing. Could I trust them? Could I really just walk away from all of this knowing what I knew now? But I didn't have a choice. They had the power, and I was just one person, a small piece in a much larger game. Yes, I typed. I understand. The figure nodded. Good. Then this will be our last communication. Remember our deal, and be grateful that we've allowed you to keep what is yours. The screen went black, and the video ended. I sat there in the dark motel room, staring at the blank screen, my mind racing. It was over, at least for now. I had escaped the Watchers, but the price was steep. I could never return to the dark web, never indulge my curiosity again. And even though they had promised to leave me alone, a part of me knew that they would always be watching, always waiting. I closed the laptop and sat back, trying to process everything that had happened. I had faced something far beyond my understanding, something that had nearly taken everything from me. But I had survived, and that had to count for something. As the first light of dawn filtered through the motel window, I made a decision. I would leave this place, leave everything behind, and start fresh. The dark web had taken me to the edge of madness, but I wasn't going to let it define me. I had my life, my identity, and that was enough. I packed my things, checked out of the motel, and got back in my car. As I drove away, the sun rising behind me, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that black SUV trailing me again. But there was nothing there. Just an empty road stretching out behind me, leading to a future that was still mine to shape. I knew I would never forget what had happened. How could I? But I also knew that I had a second chance. A chance to reclaim my life and leave the darkness behind. And as long as I never clicked another link on the dark web, I would be free. I never thought much about the dark web. Sure, I'd heard about it in passing, rumors mostly. Friends would joke about buying weird stuff online or finding bizarre communities, but I always brushed it off as urban legend material. But now, looking back, I wish I had taken those jokes more seriously. Maybe then I would have been more careful, more suspicious of the too-good-to-be-true job offer that landed in my inbox one late Saturday night. I was in a bit of a rough spot financially. My job as a graphic designer was barely covering the bills, and freelance gigs were drying up faster than I could find new ones. So when I received an email from an unknown sender with the subject line, "Freelance opportunity, urgent response needed," I didn't hesitate. I opened it immediately. The email was simple, almost too simple. It read, "Hello Liam, we've come across your work online and believe you'd be a perfect fit for a project we're working on. The pay is $5,000 for a week's work, and will require full confidentiality. Please reply if you're interested, and we'll provide further details. Best regards, MJ." I stared at the email for a while, rereading it multiple times. My name was in the greeting, which wasn't unusual. I had a portfolio online after all, but something about it felt off. There was no company name, no website, just an initial. Despite the red flags, the mention of $5,000 for a week's work was too tempting to ignore. I could clear my debt, maybe even put some money aside for once. Without thinking it through, I replied with a short message saying I was interested. A response came within minutes. They provided more details, a project involving designing some sensitive documents for a client who needed discretion. They explained that the documents were to be used internally, and the sensitive nature was merely due to the competitive business environment they operated in. The catch? I had to sign a non-disclosure agreement before I could proceed. It wasn't the first time I'd signed an NDA, so I didn't think much of it. I printed it out, signed it, and scanned it back. The next day I received the first half of the payment, $2,500, wired directly into my account. It was the fastest I'd ever made money in my life, and it almost felt too easy. but I wasn't going to complain. That evening I received the files I needed to work on. They were encrypted, and the client provided a specific decryption key that, once used, would erase itself. I wasn't exactly a tech genius, but I knew enough to realize this was serious. Still, curiosity got the better of me, and I proceeded to open the files. At first glance, the documents seemed harmless. Spreadsheets, charts, and some corporate-looking presentations. But as I dug deeper, I started to notice patterns that didn't sit right. Some of the data was heavily redacted, with names and dates blacked out. A few documents had cryptic notes in the margins, written in a language I didn't recognize. It was around this point that I started to get uneasy. I tried to convince myself it was just a high-level corporate deal, but a nagging feeling in the back of my mind kept growing. What was I really working on? And why was there such an emphasis on secrecy? A few days into the project, things took a darker turn. I received an email from MJ again, but this time it wasn't a standard progress check. The message was chilling in its brevity. "Do not contact anyone about this project. We know where you live." My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't told them where I lived, and my address wasn't listed in my portfolio. They knew my name, they knew my bank details, and now they knew where I lived. I suddenly felt very exposed, like I had stepped into something way over my head. That night I barely slept. Every noise in my apartment seemed amplified. Every creak of the floorboards felt like an impending threat. I tried to shake it off the next morning, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But when I left for a coffee run, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A black SUV parked across the street from my apartment building, its windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. I wouldn't have thought much of it if it weren't for the fact that it wasn't there the day before. I convinced myself it was a coincidence. Maybe someone new had moved in, or it was just a visiting relative. But the SUV was still there when I returned, and again the next morning parked in the same spot. That's when I knew something was wrong. I tried to act normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A few days later, my worst fears were confirmed. I was working late one night when I heard a noise outside my door. It was faint, like someone lightly tapping. I froze, listening intently. The tapping continued for a few seconds, then stopped. I stood up, my heart pounding, and slowly approached the door. I wasn't sure what I expected, but when I looked through the peephole, I was met with nothing but an empty hallway. Still, something made me reach for the door handle. When I opened the door, I saw a small, plain envelope lying on the floor. No markings, no address, just my name written in black ink. My hands trembled as I picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message: "You are in too deep. Finish the job or you and your family will pay the price." That's when I knew I wasn't just in over my head. I was in real danger. I tried to tell myself it was a bluff, that they couldn't possibly know who my family was, but deep down I knew better. These people had resources, and they had already proven they could find out anything about me. I was stuck. If I didn't finish the project, I risked not only my life, but the lives of my loved ones. And if I did finish it, who knew what would happen afterward? One thing was clear. I couldn't go to the police. Whoever these people were, they were far beyond anything the authorities could handle. I was on my own. In that moment, I made a decision. I would finish the job, but I would do everything in my power to protect my family. I started taking precautions, keeping in close contact with my relatives without raising any alarms. I installed security cameras around my apartment and started planning an escape route, just in case. But the more I worked on the project, the more I realized there was no way out. These weren't just business documents, they were blueprints for something far more sinister. And the deeper I went, the more I understood that I had become a pawn in a game I didn't even know I was playing. And that's when I started to seriously consider running, just disappearing, leaving everything behind. But I knew it wouldn't be that simple. They would find me, just like they had found me in the first place. And if I ran, it wouldn't just be me they'd go after, it would be my family. For now, all I could do was finish the job and hope that it would be enough to keep them at bay. But deep down, I knew that whatever I did, there was no escaping the consequences. And that's how it all began. The job offer that turned my life upside down and made me realize that sometimes the only way to survive is to run as far as you can and never look back. After the envelope incident, my nerves were shot. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching, even when I was sure I was alone. Every time I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment, my heart would race. I started avoiding going out as much as possible, ordering groceries online and staying indoors. The less I was exposed, the safer I felt. Or at least, that's what I kept telling myself. As I worked on the project, I started noticing things that I hadn't before. The files I was editing contained snippets of information that, when pieced together, started to paint a disturbing picture. There were references to locations, times, and certain assets that needed to be secured. The language was cryptic, almost like code, but I could tell these weren't just routine business transactions. This was something much darker. One night, while I was editing a particularly dense document, I came across a phrase that stood out like a beacon. Phase 1, containment. It was followed by a list of names, none of which I recognized, but something about it sent a chill down my spine. The list was long, too long, and it seemed to include people from all walks of life, doctors, teachers, even a few government officials. It didn't make any sense to me at the time, but the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. I decided to do some digging on my own. Using an old laptop I hadn't connected to the internet in years, I started researching some of the terms and names I found in the documents. It wasn't easy. Most of the information was buried deep in obscure forums or behind paywalls, but I was persistent. What I found made my stomach turn. The names on the list were connected to a series of unexplained disappearances over the past decade. Every person on that list had vanished without a trace, their cases left cold by law enforcement. No connections had ever been made between them, but now I could see the pattern. These weren't random disappearances. They were targeted, methodical, and covered up by someone with serious power. And here I was, unknowingly contributing to whatever this was. I started to panic. The SUV was still parked outside my building every day, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was there for me. But I couldn't just stop working on the project. It was too late for that. They knew where I lived, they knew about my family, and I had no doubt they would make good on their threats if I didn't comply. One evening, as I was staring blankly at my computer screen, my phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. I hesitated before opening it, already dreading what it might say. The message was brief. We need you to deliver the files in person, tomorrow, 10 p.m. Instructions to follow. I felt my stomach drop. They wanted me to meet them. The idea of coming face to face with whoever was behind this terrified me, but I knew I didn't have a choice. I replied with a simple, okay, and waited. The next day was torture. Every hour felt like an eternity, and I could barely focus on anything other than the impending meeting. Around 8 p.m., another message came through with an address, a nondescript location on the outskirts of town, far from any populated areas. The message also included a single line of text, "Come alone, no tricks." I knew I had to go, but I wasn't going to go in blind. I made sure my phone's location was off and left it at home, taking an old burner phone I'd kept for emergencies instead. I also made sure to inform a close friend that I was meeting a client for a late-night job and asked them to check in on me the next morning. I didn't give them any details, just enough to raise an alarm if I didn't show up. The drive to the location was surreal. It was a desolate area, with no streetlights and only the occasional passing car. The address led me to a warehouse that looked abandoned. Broken windows, rusted doors, the whole 9 yards. My heart was pounding as I parked the car and walked up to the entrance. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, the warehouse was dark, save for a few dim lights hanging from the ceiling. The air was thick with dust, and every step I took echoed in the vast empty space. I could feel my pulse in my ears as I walked further in, scanning the area for any signs of movement. That's when I saw him. A man standing in the shadows near the far wall, his face obscured by the darkness. He didn't move as I approached, and I couldn't make out any details about him. He was just a silhouette watching me. My hands were shaking as I held out the USB drive with the files, unsure of what to expect. "Is this everything?" the man asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Yes," I replied, barely able to keep my voice steady. "It's all there." He stepped forward, just enough for me to see the outline of his face. He was wearing a mask, the kind that covered the lower half of his face, leaving only his eyes visible. Cold, unfeeling eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. "You've done well," he said, taking the USB drive from my hand. "But remember, this is just the beginning." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the warehouse. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to process what had just happened. Finally, I forced myself to move, stumbling back to my car in a daze. As I drove home, the reality of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Whatever I had gotten involved in was far bigger than I had imagined, and now there was no turning back. I knew they would contact me again, and when they did, I would be ready. Because I had to be. My life, and the lives of my family, depended on it. But as I pulled into my driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just made a deal with the devil, and that the real nightmare was only just beginning. After that night at the warehouse, I tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but the tension hanging over my life was unbearable. Every day felt like walking on a tightrope, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I didn't hear from them for almost a week, and in that time, I was constantly on edge, jumping at every sound and checking over my shoulder whenever I left my apartment. I was barely sleeping, and when I did manage to doze off, my dreams were plagued by dark, shadowy figures and that cold, masked face from the warehouse. I knew deep down that this wasn't over, that it would never be over. But part of me hoped that maybe, just maybe, they were done with me. That I had done what they asked, and now they would leave me alone. That hope was shattered one morning when I woke up to a knock on my door. It was a normal knock, not the eerie tapping I had heard before, but it still made my heart race. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I certainly wasn't in the mood for visitors. I peered through the peephole and saw a delivery man standing there, holding a package. Reluctantly, I opened the door. The delivery man handed me the package, had me sign for it, and left without saying a word. I closed the door and stared at the box, my mind racing. It was plain, brown, with no markings except my name and address. I hadn't ordered anything, and I knew better than to believe this was some kind of innocent mistake. With trembling hands, I opened the box. Inside was a small black phone, brand new, still in its packaging. There was no note, no explanation, just the phone. I didn't need one. I knew exactly what this meant. They were giving me a direct line, a way for them to contact me whenever they wanted. My heart sank as I realized that any illusion of control I had was gone. They were in charge now, and I was just along for the ride. Later that day, the phone buzzed with a single message. "We'll be in touch, stay ready." I couldn't even bring myself to respond. What could I say? I was trapped in a nightmare with no way out, and all I could do was wait for their next move. Every minute felt like an eternity as I tried to go about my day, but the dread in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. I tried to distract myself by visiting my family. I needed to see them, to make sure they were okay. But even that brought no relief. My parents were happy to see me, but I couldn't help noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. Like how my mom's smile didn't reach her eyes, or how my dad seemed more distracted than usual. Was it just my paranoia, or were they hiding something from me? I couldn't tell anymore. After dinner, as I was helping my mom with the dishes, she turned to me with a concerned look. "You've been quiet tonight," she said. "Is everything okay?" I forced a smile, trying to hide the storm raging inside me. "Yeah, just tired from work." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue. "You know we're always here for you, right? If you ever need to talk." I nodded, feeling a pang of guilt. I wanted to tell her everything, to let her know what was really going on, but I couldn't. They'd already warned me, and I wasn't willing to put my family at risk. I kept my mouth shut, knowing that it was safer for them if they didn't know the truth. That night, after I returned home, I got another message on the black phone. "Tomorrow, 11 p.m. Be ready." No explanation, no details, just another cryptic command. I didn't sleep at all that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what they wanted from me this time. I tried to think of a way out, some way to break free from their grip, but nothing came to mind. I was trapped, and they knew it. The next day passed in a blur. I barely ate, my stomach too twisted with anxiety to keep anything down. As the clock ticked closer to 11 p.m., I felt the walls closing in around me. I paced around my apartment, checking the time every few minutes, trying to prepare myself for whatever was coming. At exactly 11 p.m., the phone buzzed again. The message was a single word: drive. It was followed by an address on the outskirts of town, another remote location, far from prying eyes. I grabbed my keys and left without thinking. The drive was a long one, winding through dark, empty roads that seemed to go on forever. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed the directions, unsure of what I would find when I got there. When I arrived, I found myself at an old, rundown motel, the kind of place where people went to disappear. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few cars that looked like they hadn't been moved in years. The whole place had an air of decay, like it had been forgotten by the rest of the world. I parked and sat in my car, waiting for further instructions. Minutes passed, and I started to wonder if this was some kind of sick joke. But then the phone buzzed again, and my blood ran cold as I read the message. "Room 12, knock twice." I got out of the car and approached the room, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. The door to room 12 was weathered and chipped, the paint peeling off in large flakes. I knocked twice, just as instructed, and waited. The door opened slightly, revealing a man's face. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with a grizzled beard and tired eyes. He didn't say a word, just nodded for me to come in. I hesitated for a moment, but then I stepped inside, knowing I didn't have a choice. The room was small and dimly lit, with shabby furniture and a musty smell that clung to the walls. The man closed the door behind me and gestured for me to sit at the table in the center of the room. I did as I was told, trying to keep my breathing steady. He sat across from me and placed a small unmarked envelope on the table. "This is your next task," he said, his voice rough and gravelly. "Follow the instructions exactly. No mistakes." I nodded, too afraid to ask questions. He pushed the envelope toward me and I took it, my hands trembling. He stared at me for a moment, as if trying to gauge my reaction. "You're in deep now," he said finally. "No turning back. You know what happens if you try to run." I swallowed hard, nodding again. I didn't trust myself to speak. With that, he stood up and walked to the door, leaving me alone in the room. I sat there for a few moments, trying to gather my thoughts, before finally opening the envelope. Inside was a piece of paper with a single line of text. "You'll know what to do when the time comes." That was it. No further instructions, no explanation. Just another cryptic message that left me more confused and scared than ever. I left the motel clutching the envelope like it was some kind of lifeline. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn deeper into something I couldn't escape. Whatever this was, it was far from over, and I had no idea what was coming next. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't safe, and neither was my family. The only thing I could do was play along, follow their instructions, and hope that somehow, some way, I could find a way out before it was too late. The drive home from the motel felt like it took hours, even though it was only a short trip. Every streetlight seemed to flicker ominously, and the darkness outside my car windows felt like it was closing in on me. I kept replaying the brief encounter with the grizzled man in my head, trying to decipher what he meant by, "You'll know what to do when the time comes." The words echoed in my mind, but no matter how much I thought about it, I couldn't make sense of them. When I finally got home, I locked the door behind me and sank into the couch, staring at the envelope that now sat on the coffee table. It was maddeningly vague, and the uncertainty gnawed at me. I knew I had to be prepared for anything, but how do you prepare for something you don't understand? The next few days were agonizing. I went through the motions of my daily life, but everything felt off, like I was moving through a fog. The black phone stayed silent, which should have been a relief, but instead it only heightened my anxiety. I couldn't stop thinking about that envelope and what kind of test they had planned for me. I found myself jumping at every little sound, convinced that someone was lurking outside my apartment. I even started keeping a bag packed with essentials, ready to run at a moment's notice. It felt paranoid, but deep down, I knew it was necessary. Whatever was coming, I had to be ready to act fast. On the third day, just as I was beginning to think they'd forgotten about me, the phone buzzed. The message was short and direct. "Tonight, midnight, instructions will follow." My heart skipped a beat. This was it. The moment I'd been dreading. I checked the time. It was only 4 p.m. I had 8 hours to prepare, but I still had no idea what I was supposed to be preparing for. I paced around my apartment, trying to think of anything that could give me an edge, but nothing came to mind. All I could do was wait. As the hours ticked by, the tension became almost unbearable. I couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything but the clock, which seemed to be moving slower and slower. Finally, at 11:50 p.m., the phone buzzed again. My hands were shaking as I picked it up to read the message. "Leave your apartment. Walk to the end of the street. A car will be waiting. Get in. Do not speak." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This was it, the moment that would determine everything. I grabbed my bag and checked that my apartment was locked up before stepping out into the cool night air. The street was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the city. I walked to the end of the street as instructed, my heart pounding in my chest. Sure enough, a black sedan was parked there, its engine idling quietly. The windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside, but I knew this was the car they had sent. Taking a deep breath, I opened the back door and slid inside. The interior was just as dark as the outside. I could barely make out the silhouette of the driver, but I didn't dare speak. I kept my eyes forward, gripping my bag tightly as the car pulled away from the curb. The ride was silent, save for the hum of the engine, and I had no idea where we were going. We drove for what felt like hours, but it was hard to tell time in the darkness. The city lights faded behind us, and the car eventually turned onto a narrow, winding road that led into a wooded area. My stomach churned with anxiety as I tried to figure out where we were headed, but I forced myself to stay calm. Finally, the car came to a stop in front of a large old house that looked like it had seen better days. The paint was peeling, and the windows were dark, giving it an almost haunted appearance. The driver said nothing as he turned off the engine, and I took that as my cue to get out. As soon as I stepped out of the car, the driver sped off, leaving me standing alone in front of the house. I looked around, but there was no one else in sight. The only sound was the rustling of the wind through the trees. I hesitated, wondering if I should go back, but I knew that wasn't an option. They had brought me here for a reason, and whatever it was, I had to face it. I approached the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. It was slightly ajar, creaking as I pushed it open. The inside of the house was even darker than the outside, the air thick with dust and the smell of decay. I took a cautious step inside, and that's when I heard it. a faint beeping sound coming from somewhere deeper in the house. My first instinct was to turn around and run, but I forced myself to keep moving. The beeping was irregular, almost like it was calling out to me, drawing me further into the house. I followed the sound down a narrow hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. At the end of the hallway, I found a small room with a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the room was a metal box, about the size of a shoebox, sitting on an old rickety table. The beeping was coming from inside the box, growing louder with each passing second. I stared at the box, unsure of what to do. This had to be the test they mentioned, but what did it mean? My mind raced as I tried to figure out the next step, but the beeping was getting louder, more insistent, and I knew I didn't have much time. Taking a deep breath, I reached out and opened the box. Inside was a small digital timer, counting down from 30 seconds. My heart nearly stopped when I saw it. This wasn't just a test, this was a threat. The timer was ticking down, and I had no idea what would happen when it hit 0. Without thinking, I grabbed the box and sprinted out of the room, my mind racing for a solution. I couldn't just leave it behind, and there was no way I could disarm it. I burst through the front door and ran as fast as I could toward the woods, my lungs burning with every breath. The timer was down to 10 seconds when I threw the box as far as I could into the trees. I didn't stop running, not even when I heard the explosion behind me. The force of it knocked me off my feet, and I hit the ground hard, gasping for air. I lay there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. The sound of the explosion still echoed in my ears, but I was alive. Somehow I had survived. As I pulled myself to my feet, I realized that this was just the beginning. They were testing me, seeing how far I was willing to go, how much I was willing to endure. And I knew that if I didn't play their game, the next time it wouldn't just be a test, it would be the real thing. I stumbled through the woods, my mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. I had to get out of there, had to disappear before they could find me again. But I knew that running wouldn't be enough. They would always be one step ahead, always watching, always waiting. As I reached the edge of the woods, I saw the glow of the city lights in the distance. For a moment I felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly snuffed out by the cold reality of my situation. There was no escape from this, not for me, and not for my family. All I could do was keep moving forward, keep playing their game, and hope that somehow, some way I could find a way out before it was too late. The explosion that night in the woods left me shaken, but it also made one thing clear: I couldn't keep going like this. They had pushed me to my limits, testing my resolve, and I knew the next step would be even more dangerous. Running was no longer just an option, it was a necessity. I spent the next few days planning my escape. I couldn't afford to be reckless. I had to be smart, careful. I knew they were watching, waiting for me to slip up, so I played my part, going about my routine as if nothing had changed. But every spare moment I had was spent preparing for my departure. The first thing I did was gather cash. Credit cards were too easy to trace. I withdrew as much as I could without raising suspicion, stashing the money in a small bag along with a burner phone and a few essentials. I also made sure to wipe my old laptop clean, destroying any trace of the files I'd worked on for them. I couldn't risk leaving any loose ends. Next, I reached out to my family under the guise of a casual visit. It was hard to keep the conversation light, knowing that I might never see them again. But I couldn't tell them what was really going on. It was safer if they didn't know. I hugged them a little tighter that day, holding on just a moment longer, trying to memorize every detail of their faces. The thought of leaving them behind was unbearable, but I knew it was the only way to keep them safe. The night before my planned escape, the black phone buzzed with another message. Tomorrow, 9 p.m. Final task. Be ready. My heart sank. They weren't done with me yet, and this final task could be the most dangerous one of all. But I couldn't let them control me any longer. I had made my decision. I was leaving, no matter what. The next day was excruciating. Every minute felt like an eternity as I waited for the evening to arrive. I kept checking the time, knowing that as soon as 9 p.m. hit, I had to be gone. The tension in the air was palpable, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't afford to lose my nerve now. At exactly 8:30 p.m., I grabbed my bag and left my apartment for the last time. I didn't look back as I locked the door, knowing that any hesitation could cost me my life. I had chosen a bus station on the outskirts of town as my departure point, somewhere low-key where I could blend in with the crowd. I had a one-way ticket to a city hundreds of miles away, where I hoped to disappear for good. As I walked down the street, the weight of what I was about to do settled in. I was leaving everything behind, my home, my family, my entire life. But there was no other choice. If I stayed, I would be putting everyone I cared about in danger. I had to believe that they would be safer without me. When I reached the bus station, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. It was crowded, busy with travelers coming and going, and I was just another face in the sea of people. I kept my head down, avoiding eye contact, and made my way to the boarding area. Just as I was about to step onto the bus, my burner phone buzzed in my pocket. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I knew it was them, and every instinct told me to ignore it, to keep walking. But something compelled me to take one last look. I pulled out the phone and read the message. "We know what you're planning. You can't run from us." Panic surged through me. I looked around, scanning the crowd for any sign of them, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the message was clear. They were watching, and they knew exactly what I was trying to do. For a brief moment, I considered abandoning my plan, turning around and running in the opposite direction. But then I remembered the explosion, the threats, the constant fear that had been suffocating me for weeks. I couldn't let them win. I had to keep going. I stepped onto the bus, my heart pounding in my chest. As the doors closed behind me, I forced myself to breathe, to stay calm. I found a seat near the back, away from the windows, and kept my head down as the bus pulled away from the station. The ride was long and tense. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, half expecting to see a black SUV tailing us, but nothing happened. The further we got from the city, the more my fear began to ease, replaced by a cautious optimism. Maybe, just maybe, I had outsmarted them. As dawn broke, the bus pulled into a station in the middle of nowhere. It was a small, sleepy town with little more than a few shops and a diner. I got off the bus and took a deep breath, the crisp morning air filling my lungs. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. I walked into the diner and ordered a coffee, sitting at the counter as I tried to collect my thoughts. I didn't know what my next move would be, but for now, I was safe. I had managed to slip through their fingers, at least for the time being. As I sipped my coffee, I couldn't help but glance at the burner phone sitting on the counter. I had thought about tossing it, getting rid of any trace of them, but something held me back. I knew it was a link to my old life, to the nightmare I had just escaped, but it was also the only connection I had left to the world I had known. For now, I decided to keep it, if only as a reminder of what I had been through. I knew they might try to contact me again, but I was done playing their game. I was free, and I intended to stay that way. As I left the diner and walked into the unfamiliar town, I felt a strange sense of peace. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. I had survived. I had made it out alive, and that was more than I could have hoped for. The road ahead would be difficult, and I would have to stay one step ahead of them, always looking over my shoulder. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a chance. I was no longer their pawn, no longer under their control. I was free. And that, I realized, was all I needed.